Stories told amongst the ruins of the American wasteland often blur the lines between fact and fiction, history and myth, truth and legend. Any news that comes from beyond a day's walk from your village, bunker, or shack should be taken with a healthy dose of skepticism. But when news reaches from beyond the vast oceans that separate the American continents from the rest of the world, it can take on a new life entirely, because it isn't every day that you hear a tale from across the pond. Terror. There was only one word to describe what he felt in that exact moment: sheer, unadulterated terror. Consciousness without identity, awareness without agency. He knew he was alive, that he merely was. Anything more he simply couldn't fathom. He had no memory, no name, no soul. He was an animal, a lab rat, and that word was horrifyingly apt given his current circumstances. He was encased in some sort of glass tank, a test tube too narrow to allow him to lay down, even to sit or crouch. He was surrounded by people in lab coats, their faces concealed behind surgical masks and goggles. They talked about him without using names, without attributing to him a single human quality. He was an experiment, a specimen, nothing more. As they poked and prodded him, a shadow loomed overhead. A man stood in a balcony, strong light at his back, reducing him to nothing more than a silhouette, an apparition that seemed to absorb the light as it tried to impotently pass it, and left everything in front of it in darkness. When it spoke, it commanded the attention of all around it, who gazed up in a sort of reverence. But the man in the tube would offer no such adulation. He was here against his will, dehumanized and wearing some sort of jumpsuit that couldn't possibly be of a person's own choosing. He would not stand idly by as a docile, servile creature, doing only what its masters command it until the day it outlives its usefulness and is discarded or disposed. But it had no history, no identity. How can a thing even be without a word to describe it? As his first act of defiance, he would ascribe a name to himself. He may be in chains, under their boot, but he would ensure they knew he was a person. He was someone. He doubted they would care regardless, but one must walk before they can run. He grabbed a word seemingly out of the air. That word would be his talisman. He had chosen a name, and in that instant he ceased to be an animal and had elevated himself to a sovereign being. It was a tiny, purely symbolic victory against his captors, but it was a start. But as fate would have it, his escape would come much sooner than he could have planned, as the facility was suddenly rocked with explosions, the concussions reverberating through his tank and making it impossible to think. And just as quickly as he had thought his way into existence, he was once again swallowed by the abyss, knocked unconscious by the blasts. When he came to, he found his tank had been cracked by the explosions, the glass weakened enough that he was able to finish the deed with his fists. He staggered out of the tank, and as he steadied himself, scanned the room for threats, allies, really anything that may warrant interaction. Everyone in this room was killed. He looked around, but the men who'd shot up the place had apparently moved on. He grabbed everything he could find that looked to be of use. All around was evidence of this facility's purpose: human experimentation. Whatever their goals were was still unknown, but the rows of occupied body bags left no illusion as to the result. He very well might have been among them if it hadn't been for his unexpected benefactors. All around this facility he encountered the same symbol fashioned to the walls, a compass and square with the letter A in the center. He had no idea what it meant, but every time he glanced up at it, he felt a pit in his stomach. Something about this symbol assailed his senses on a primal level. He entered a vast corridor and heard muffled screaming and the unmistakable sound of gunfire. The attack on this facility was very much still in progress. Lucky for him, he was wearing that strange jumpsuit. He was a little cold, a little wet from the tank, but at least he wasn't wearing the uniform of one of the belligerents. Hopefully that meant he was safe from getting targeted during the attack. Thankfully, this section of the facility he was standing in appeared to already be swept clean by the attackers. In a manner of speaking, anyway. He carefully looked for a way out. He passed through a pristine nuclear reactor chamber. Apparently, this group was sophisticated, enough so that they can keep a reactor looking brand new, or possibly even construct post-war reactors. In another area, he passed through a room filled with cages. Many contained rad shrews. Apparently, there was a degree of testing going on before humans like himself found their way under the knife. Or possibly there was another, even more nefarious purpose for these poor creatures. He decided to open the cages as the critters appeared to be dead, and future progress through the facility seemed to be tied to an all-or-nothing door mechanism unlocked by a nearby terminal. Why anyone would think that was a good security feature, we may never know, but activating the failsafe was the first in a long line of critical miscalculations he would commit that day. The rodents that appeared to be dead while locked away suddenly rose and charged at him with their horrific teeth gnashing and gnawing at him like a horde of the undead. A horrible little menace, to be sure. With nothing but his fists to fight them off, he fought desperately for his life and thankfully came out on top. This would have been a short and pointless tale I'm telling otherwise. The next chamber he came to was a computer bank, a row of devices that seemed to be used to interface with other small components. There were consoles, widgets, and doodads of every shape and size, most of which he couldn't identify their intended purpose. But along one wall was a pair of olive drab devices. They looked like terminals, but small enough to carry around with you. They each had a hollow tube running through their chassis as if they were designed to fit around a person's arm like a cuff or a wristwatch. Between the two of these stood a very similar but very different device. It appeared to have many of the same features: a small computer screen, a few switches, dials, and knobs to navigate the operating system and input data, and even appeared to be able to accept radio broadcasts. It also had a holotape player built into the back, but this one, this Attaboy as it was apparently called, was instead designed to clip to a tool belt, which conveniently enough there was one laying around nearby. Donning the belt and testing the fit of the Attaboy, he had suddenly and significantly improved his chances of making it out of this place. He used the device to take inventory of the items he had been gathering. Apparently it was sophisticated enough that it automatically cataloged the items on his person, so that was nifty. He threw on a lab coat, which was little better than the form-fitted jumpsuit he wore out of his tank, but it was better than nothing, slightly, and it was dry. He approached a console that appeared to control a nearby doorway and identified a port that appeared to match a socket on the bottom of the Attaboy. Inserting the Attaboy allowed him to open the door and continue. He tried to approach an elevator where he could hear some blokes arguing. They apparently knew there was someone standing outside the elevator doors, but they didn't seem interested in carrying out a rescue mission. They cut power from the corridor he was in and rerouted it to the elevator, and off they went, while he was left in darkness. Fumbling through the corridor with nothing but the light of the fires that were beginning to spread throughout the facility, he found a corpse brandishing a flashlight, or torch as they call it on that side of the pond. This one also clipped to the belt and allowed him to see where he was going. He wandered through lab spaces, carefully scanning the workbenches for anything of use before he came to a hallway fairly devoid of anything interesting beside a large glass window, looking in on some sort of command center and conference room. But far more important to him was the man staring silently out the window, the shadow, the apparition. The dark god who commanded his worshippers here to commit unspeakable acts on living and aware beings. The shadow spoke cryptically, condescendingly, and nothing came out. Not a single piece of information that explained who he was, why he was here, other than to be a lab rat, and more importantly, where here was. Their conversation was cut short as flames began to fan into the conference room from an adjacent chamber. As a fireproof shutter lowered over the window to contain the inferno, the man simply stared at the flames morosely until the shutter closed and the shadow he cast simply disappeared into the very void from which it came. Rushing from this place before the flames trapped him as well, he stepped through a doorway to find himself in a massive chamber. The walls were so tall that even if he could crane his neck so far to see the top, it was shrouded in shadow. He stood at the base of a staircase, flanked by a pair of massive stone lions standing vigil. In the courtyard beyond, a large fountain continued to perform its delicate aquatic ballet, and the ruined remains of shops, mannequins, and other relics of commerce littered the area. Even in its dilapidated state, the sheer scale and thoughtful symmetry of this place seemed to bring him comfort. But where was he? Was he somehow deep underground, or was this a massive above-ground fortress? It was apparently devoid of windows, so in either event, he couldn't tell for certain. Just as he took a step toward the stairs to investigate further, he heard a jingle that instantly put him on edge once more. A pair of massive screens flashed to life, and a voice illustrated by the drawing of a finely dressed man taunted him from far above his reach. The voice mocked and jeered. It ascribed a word to him, one he refused to acknowledge. He had already chosen a name, and his captors would not be allowed to strip that from him. The voice congratulated him on his escape, though the fact that he was still in a position to hear this message meant he wasn't letting his guard down for an instant. The voice identified itself as Smythe, bid him to make his way outside this place, but offered no explanation about what they were doing to him, what this place even was. He simply blathered condescendingly for a time and signed off with the most British statement one could possibly muster: mind the gap. He held out for the swarm of men wearing red lab coats like the one he was wearing to approach from every shadow, but none came. Perhaps he truly had managed to escape. The same symbol of the compass and square was still conspicuously displayed here, but this was obviously not a well-maintained lab filled with state-of-the-art pre-war and post-war technology. He searched for a way out of here. There was an elevator, or lift as people there call them, but it appeared to be locked down. There was a large sliding door, but it was apparently chained shut. As he made his way into the courtyard, he searched for valuables. There were a few hats on display on some mannequins and various sundries littering the pre-war storefronts, but otherwise this place was a waste, and he still hadn't found anything that could be used as a weapon. Finally, he came to an entrance to the London Underground, and the thought struck him. Smythe's mocking sign-off, "Mind the gap," was a common English warning to travelers preparing to embark or dismount a train. Mind the gap. Was Smythe actually helping him? No, there had to be more to it. It had to be a trap. But in the absence of other options, he had no choice but to run his maze. Inside the station, he found a sign welcoming visitors to the Shard. Apparently, this place had a name before the war, which would make sense. He couldn't think of a reason why someone would create an enormous, ostentatious building to sell hats in after such a thing as an apocalypse. As he moved deeper into the underground, he found more radshrews infesting more shops. In one, he found some Jimmy hats, a funny word for, you know, if you're telling this story to kids, just leave this part out and use your imagination. He found a skeleton still brandishing a walking stick and holding a magazine. He decided to see what he could learn from the magazine and set off wishing the man had been packing something heavier than a cane. Still, it was better than using his fists. He found collapsed tunnels infested with rad roaches, the walls covered in graffiti and billboards filled with propaganda, and finally found himself above ground standing in front of what appeared to be an intact train. As he stepped in to see if there was anything of value, the door slammed shut behind him and the train began to roll down the tracks. Like a ballistic missile, he rushed through the ruins of London, at one time the largest city in the world, and now one of the largest piles of radioactive rubble in the world. He craned his neck to get his bearings. He didn't recognize anything, but several landmarks could hopefully help him find his way through the rubble. Suddenly, there was a terrible sound of crumpling steel and crumbling stone and concrete as he found himself flying toward the front of his car. And then, pain, blackness, silence. The void took him once more. When he came to, he found himself surrounded by rubble, some of it from the train now protruding from a crumbling residence, some of it from long before. It was nearly pitch black out and he was alone, though he couldn't tell if that was a blessing or yet another manifestation of his own rotten luck. He was wounded, weakened from the crash, or he hadn't eaten or drank anything since ever, come to think of it. Down the street, he saw the illumination of a single, still working street lamp with 3 figures standing underneath, so he made his way there cautiously. He was in no state to fight anyone off with nothing but his walking stick, so hopefully they were friendly. To his surprise, and theirs, these men were the ones that had blasted their way through the facility that had been holding him. A man named Sebastian Gaunt spoke for the group, and got rather snippy if any of the others tried to speak out of turn. Gaunt identified them as the Vagabonds, some sort of gang engaging in the usual street wars. Gaunt also demanded that the man standing before them identify himself and what he was doing in that place, but all he could do was tell them what they likely already knew. He was being experimented on in the lab, their assault allowed him to escape, and he boarded a train that crashed nearby. It was in this moment that Gaunt ascribed a word to the man. It was the same one that Smythe had used. He couldn't explain it, but the man actually seemed to enjoy it this time around. Wayfarer. A traveler, specifically a person who travels on foot. It seemed fitting. It had no personal meaning to himself, so nothing to take insult over, and given what appeared to be no remaining infrastructure capable of powered locomotion, it seemed to him a literal description of what he was, especially given the fact that he had neither a home to go back to or a destination to head toward. It was also a synonym for the word vagabond, so he took it as a compliment coming from these men, in a way identifying themselves as kindred spirits without actually including him among their number. Gaunt and his men seemed seemed fairly forthcoming with information. As it happens, they didn't plan the attack on the lab, instead they were only there to search for supplies, assuming it to be abandoned. They had bought the location off some people called Thamesfolk. When he asked about a doctor, Gaunt said that he could either try his luck reaching the Thamesfolk or he could tag along with the vagabonds. Although he was touched by this apparent gesture of friendship, he didn't know these men, their motives, or where their loyalties truly lied. But he did know they were violent, and their leader seemed to have a bit of a short temper. For now, it seemed that the Thamesfolk were his best bet at finding answers and medical care. Gaunt gave him directions for how to reach their settlement, Thameshaven, and he and his men started heading deeper into the ruins of Lewisham, in the opposite direction from Thameshaven. Standing alone, illuminated against the blackness, with the street lamp casting a gentle halo, the man looked on toward the direction of Thameshaven. His mind was shattered, his body broken. He was clothed in a red lab coat that for him symbolized pain and suffering. His only defense against the dangers of London was the cane that in his current condition was actually being used for its intended purpose. But he was determined to find answers. He would reach Thameshaven. He would get the answers that he needed, and he would one day stand face to face with Smythe. On this, he was resolute. He steeled his resolve and placed one foot in front of the other. In this exact instant, his journey truly started. In this moment, the legend of the Wayfarer was born. This episode of Across the Pond is thanks to my patrons over at Patreon. Their direct contributions cannot be understated. Welcome to Carver050, who recently joined our ranks as an officer-level patron, and He Who Shan't Be Named, who joined the enlisted ranks as a non-com. All Patreon funds are reserved for investment directly back into Grey Gaming's production costs. No Blamco mac and cheese or Vim purchases are enabled by patronage. That's all thanks to you, the random person on the internet that made it this far into the video and is still watching. Until my next salute, stand at ease. Thank you so much for watching to the end, stay safe, and I hope to see you here next time on Grey Gaming.